A veteran officer, frustrated with the arrival of a new police chief, sees an older woman struggling with coffee in the parking lot. Filled with prejudice, he lashes out, spilling hot coffee on her. Little does he know, she's not just any woman, she's his new boss, the one he's been dreading. What will happen when the tables turn? Before starting the story, comment down from where in world are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling stories. As the precinct prepared for the new chief's arrival, Jack Turner's resolve hardened. He treated every passing moment like it was a countdown to an inevitable showdown. The break room had become his stage, each new officer who entered his presence becoming an audience for his tirades. "Mark my words," Jack scoffed, grabbing a cup of coffee with enough force that some splashed onto the counter. "She won't know what hit her." He chuckled darkly, the edges of his mouth curling into a smirk. His buddies exchanged uncomfortable glances, but none dared to confront him. Jack's reputation for holding a grudge was as notorious as his bigoted opinions. The day finally came. The precinct was buzzing like a hive, officers pretending to go about their duties while sneaking glances at the entrance. Jack sat in the break room, his eyes fixed on the door like a predator awaiting its prey. He had mentally prepared a scathing remark for her first appearance, something that would let her know exactly where she stood in his precinct. The door creaked open. In walked a woman dressed in sharp, professional attire, her demeanor calm but commanding. She was older, her face lined with the wisdom of experience and years of hard work. She didn't look like she came to play games. As she entered, the officers straightened up, respect radiating from their stiff postures. But Jack? Jack leaned back in his chair, his expression smug, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As she neared the break room, Jack loudly remarked to no one in particular, "Oh great, here comes our diversity hire. Hope she doesn't break a nail writing parking tickets." His voice dripped with sarcasm, loud enough for her to hear. Without missing a beat, the woman paused at the doorway. She turned, locking eyes with Jack, who still wore his smug grin like a badge of honor. The room fell silent, tension thick enough to cut with a knife. She gave him a long, measured look, then coolly replied, "If that's how you speak to your superior, Officer Turner, I'd hate to hear what you say to suspects." Jack's grin faltered. His fellow officers glanced at one another, waiting for his usual quick retort, but it never came. The woman walked past, a knowing smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth, leaving Jack in stunned silence. The battle he had been so sure of was over before it even began. Jack's steps grew more deliberate, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. His boots echoed louder against the pavement, each strike punctuating the growing tension in his chest. He could feel the heat rising, like a furnace stoked by a relentless wind. He needed an outlet, something to snap him out of this feeling of helplessness. And then, there she was, this woman, struggling with a tray of coffees, her eyes focused on her task, unaware of the storm brewing just behind her. Without thinking, Jack's impatience flared. He marched up to her, his heavy steps making the ground tremble. He couldn't help it, his frustrations needed to spill out, and she was the easiest target. "Watch where you're going," Jack barked, his voice sharp and harsh, filled with venom. He barely looked at her as he shoved past, intentionally brushing against her, hoping to rattle her, to make her stumble. The woman's grip tightened around the tray as she staggered slightly but didn't fall. Jack's eyes flicked over her once more, now noticing the slight tremble in her hands as she struggled to maintain her composure. "You okay there?" he sneered, voice dripping with mock concern. She paused for a moment, steadying herself, then turned to face him. Her eyes met his, calm, but with a sharp edge of something Jack couldn't quite place. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, her voice steady and soft, but the words hit him like a sharp slap. Her tone wasn't defensive or panicked, it was almost unbothered. Jack wasn't used to that. He was used to people shrinking under his presence, cowering from the anger he could so easily unleash. But this woman? She stood her ground, completely unfazed. Jack blinked, his chest tightening as a flicker of unease crept up his spine. "I didn't ask for your gratitude," he muttered, more to himself than to her, his jaw clenched tightly. He looked her over again, this time noticing the old leather bag slung over her shoulder, a no-nonsense accessory, like someone who'd seen the rough side of the world and learned how to carry it without complaint. And the coffee? The woman was delivering it, not just carrying it. Something was off, but Jack couldn't quite put his finger on it. "You new around here?" he asked, his tone tinged with suspicion. The woman didn't answer right away, and for a long moment, Jack was sure she was just going to walk away, dismissing him like the inconsequential man he had become in his own mind. Instead, she stepped closer, meeting his gaze unwaveringly. "Not new," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "Just here for the long haul." "Seems that's more than I can say for you." For a split second, Jack froze. His breath caught in his throat as he realized what she meant. She wasn't just talking about his temper or his bad day. She was talking about something deeper, something he hadn't fully confronted himself. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Before he could respond, she turned and continued walking toward the station, the tray of coffees still steady in her hands. Jack stood there, watching her, feeling the slow burn of realization creeping under his skin. It wasn't just that she didn't react to him the way most people did, it was that she had seen him, not just as an angry officer, but as something more fragile beneath it all. And that thought, that unsettling feeling, gnawed at him as he stood frozen, staring at the woman's retreating form. Jack stood motionless, the sound of her footsteps growing fainter with every passing second. His mind raced, his thoughts a tangled mess of fury and confusion. He couldn't process it, couldn't wrap his head around the fact that this woman, this nobody, had just taken his best shot and walked away. For a moment, all he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears, drowning out the distant chatter from the precinct, the rustling of the wind, and even the faint hum of cars passing in the street. His grip tightened around the coffee cup still clenched in his hand, the remnants of the coffee sloshing at the edges, and yet, he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the place where she had disappeared, willing himself to take a step forward. But something, some foreign sensation, held him back. It wasn't fear. No, Jack Turner didn't know fear. But it was something like doubt. Doubt that he hadn't felt in a long time. His chest tightened at the realization that he wasn't sure how to finish this. For the first time in his life, Jack didn't know how to play the game. He shook his head violently, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. He tried to tell himself it didn't matter, that he was still in control, that he could walk back into the station and laugh it off. But his pride, that thick layer of arrogance he'd relied on for years, felt suddenly fragile. He could still hear her words ringing in his ears, echoing louder with each passing second. "You're a coward." No, that couldn't be true. He was a cop. He was tough. He had built his reputation by being the hardest, most unflinching officer in the precinct. But something about the way she said it, so calm, so steady, like she'd seen him, tore through that illusion of invincibility. The realization was almost suffocating. His fists clenched tighter. No one had ever called him a coward before. Not to his face. He'd never allowed it. He'd spent years wearing his anger like armor, but now that she had pierced through it so effortlessly, he was left standing there, exposed and raw. Was this what it felt like to be seen for who you really were? Was this what it felt like to be known? A mix of humiliation and rage surged through him, and without thinking, he turned and stormed toward the precinct doors, his steps heavy and filled with purpose. He would make this right. He would fix this. He was the one in charge here. He was the one who'd been doing things the right way for years. This was his precinct, his turf. And this woman, this outsider, she didn't belong here. As he pushed through the doors, the familiar sights and sounds of the precinct hit him like a wave. Officers were scattered around, talking in hushed tones, and the usual clatter of keyboards and ringing phones filled the air. But none of it felt comforting. Instead, it felt foreign, like everything had shifted just slightly, and he was no longer the center of it all. The break room door was ajar. Jack's jaw tightened as he strode toward it, his hand resting on the doorframe as he peered inside. The woman from the parking lot was sitting at a table, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light as she unwrapped a sandwich. She hadn't even acknowledged his entrance. But Jack wasn't backing down. He stepped inside, his presence demanding attention. "You," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We need to talk." She didn't flinch. Didn't even look up. Instead, she continued to unwrap her food, the silence between them growing thicker. Jack's hands balled into fists again. The nerve. She wasn't even bothering to give him the time of day. "I'm talking to you," he pressed, his voice sharper now, his patience wearing thin. Finally, she looked up at him. Her gaze was steady, unflinching. She studied him for a moment, like she was weighing whether or not to even acknowledge his presence. Then, slowly, she wiped her hands on a napkin and leaned back in her chair. "Did you need something, Officer Turner?" Her tone was almost too calm, as if she'd already seen this confrontation coming. Jack's mind raced. He wanted to unleash everything, the insults, the anger, the frustration. But when he opened his mouth, all he could manage was a low growl. "I'm not some outsider to be pushed around. You come into my precinct, make a scene, and now you think you can just ignore me? I don't care who you are or what your job is. You need to show some respect." The woman didn't flinch at his outburst. She didn't even seem to take offense. Instead, she studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in his words. Then, to Jack's surprise, she smiled. It wasn't a mocking smile, not exactly. But there was something in it that made his blood run cold. "You think you've been disrespected," she said slowly, almost thoughtfully. "But what you've been feeling isn't disrespect, Jack. It's fear." Jack froze. The word hit him like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of him. Fear? He was not afraid. He had nothing to fear. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, his voice rougher now, though he couldn't quite shake the hesitation that had crept into his chest. "I don't care what you think." Her gaze softened ever so slightly. "I know you don't. But you should." The weight of her words pressed on him, sinking deep into his skin. Jack turned away abruptly, swallowing the lump in his throat. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let her see him falter. Not again. But as he walked out of the room, her words echoed in his mind, lingering longer than any insult he had ever thrown. He wasn't sure how to shake them. Not yet. But for the first time in a long while, Jack Turner wasn't so certain of who he was, or of what kind of man he wanted to be. Jack's stomach twisted into a tight knot, the weight of his mistake crashing down on him like a ton of bricks. His palms went clammy, and for the first time in years, his mouth went dry. He stood frozen, unable to move or speak as the woman, Chief Samantha Cole, held the badge in front of him, her fingers lightly caressing its surface like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her gaze never wavered from his, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a quiet authority that Jack could feel even from a distance. The kind of presence that made it impossible to ignore her, even when she was standing in front of him, drenched in scalding coffee. His mind was racing, scrambling for some way to salvage this, but every instinct he had told him he was well beyond the point of redemption. "Chief," he muttered, the word almost foreign on his tongue. She nodded slowly, as if the answer should have been obvious. Her eyes softened just slightly, but there was no mistaking the quiet power she radiated now that she had revealed who she was. The calm, measured way she held herself made Jack feel smaller with every passing second. "I'm afraid I wasn't expecting this kind of welcome," she said, her voice still soft, but laced with an undercurrent of something that made the hairs on his neck stand up even further. "But it seems we're off to a rather rocky start, Officer Turner." Jack's mouth went dry again, and for a moment, all he could do was stand there, staring at the badge in her hand, the weight of it pressing down on him like a lead balloon. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, and the walls of the precinct, the very place he thought he ruled, suddenly seemed to close in on him. The realization hit him like a freight train. She wasn't just some administrative worker, some nobody who could be ignored. She was the police chief, the person he was supposed to answer to, the one he'd been mocking and belittling without a second thought. His throat went tight. I didn't know. I didn't mean." "I'm sure you didn't," she interrupted, her voice smooth but with a chilling finality. "But your actions still have consequences, don't they?" Jack swallowed hard, his mind scrambling for something to say. Some way to salvage his pride, to take back the words and the actions he'd thrown at her. But there was nothing. He couldn't take it back. He couldn't pretend this was some simple mistake that could be brushed off. He'd just insulted and humiliated the person who now had the power to end his career with a single word. For the first time in his life, Jack felt small. He felt exposed. Chief Cole's expression softened slightly, but there was no kindness in it. It wasn't an expression of sympathy or mercy, it was an expression of a person who had been through too much to be fazed by something as trivial as a man's bruised ego. You know, she continued, her voice taking on a thoughtful tone, it's never easy, stepping into a new role. Especially when there are people like you. She paused, taking a slow breath, and Jack could feel the weight of those words like a punch to the gut. People who think they have it all figured out, who think they know how things should be. Who think they get to dictate what the world around them looks like. Her eyes locked onto his again, and this time, Jack couldn't tear his gaze away. There was no malice in her eyes, no anger. Just a quiet understanding that made his stomach twist in knots. I'm not here to play games, Officer Turner, she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. I'm not here to pander to anyone's prejudices or their outdated ideas about how things should be. I'm here to lead. And if you're smart, you'll start figuring out exactly where you stand in that equation. The air between them felt thick, charged, and Jack found himself struggling to breathe. His jaw tightened, but this time, he couldn't summon the strength to argue. He couldn't summon the anger or the bravado that had always served as his shield. The realization that he had just pissed off the one person who could ruin him, no, not ruin, destroy him, set in like a cold shiver creeping down his spine. I didn't know, Jack stammered, though even as the words left his mouth, he could hear how weak they sounded. I didn't know you were. You should've, she interrupted, her tone growing sharper. If you'd bothered to do your job, instead of running your mouth, you would have known exactly who I was before this even happened. Jack swallowed again, his throat painfully dry. The pit of dread in his stomach only grew deeper. Every word she said cut through him like a blade, and he couldn't stop himself from feeling the weight of it all. He had just tested the patience of a woman who was now his superior. A woman who had taken all of his abuse and instead of retaliating, had merely existed. She had stood tall, faced him down, and in doing so, had proven that he was the one who was in the wrong all along. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to beg for forgiveness, but the words caught in his throat. His pride, that blasted pride, wouldn't let him. He just stood there, helpless, watching as she slowly stepped around him, the sound of her shoes clicking against the concrete floor echoing like a reminder that he was no longer the one in control. Next time, Officer Turner, she said, her voice cold but firm, you might want to think before you act. There are consequences to every choice we make. I hope you'll remember that. With those final words, she walked past him, her movements graceful but purposeful. Jack stood there for a long time, still unable to move, his mind still reeling from the humiliation. The weight of the moment settled in his chest like a lead weight, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Something he wasn't prepared for. Jack stood frozen, his feet seemingly cemented to the asphalt beneath him. His thoughts whirled in a chaotic, spiraling mess. What had just happened? One moment, he was full of contempt and superiority, and the next, he was utterly deflated, a ragged balloon of misplaced pride and foolish bravado. The weight of Chief Cole's gaze, unflinching and unyielding, hung in the air like a tangible force. Her calm demeanor, her composed, unbroken posture, only magnified the crushing realization that this wasn't just an encounter with some administrative staff. This was the beginning of a whole new chapter in his life, one where he had no control. You'll want to remember this moment, officer, she had said. Her voice, steady and unwavering, echoed in his mind. It was a threat, not a promise. A warning he couldn't ignore. Directly to me, those words hit him harder than the scalding coffee he had thrown at her. Jack's mouth went dry, a bitter taste filling the back of his throat. The arrogance that had made him feel invincible, like he could bully and belittle anyone without consequence, evaporated in an instant. His body felt heavy, like the ground beneath him had suddenly become an anchor, weighing him down as if trying to keep him from escaping the mess he had just created. For the first time in years, Jack didn't know what to do. The usual fight-or-flight instinct, the one that had always driven him to assert dominance, was gone. Gone. He wasn't sure if it had fled out of fear or sheer disbelief, but it was no longer there. He was exposed, vulnerable. And it was all his doing. He tried to speak, to offer some sort of excuse, some clever retort that would put him back in the driver's seat, but the words didn't come. He opened his mouth but only a raspy breath escaped. His lungs felt tight, and his chest constricted as if the very air had thickened around him. He couldn't find the words, because the truth was, there was nothing he could say that would undo what he had just done. His ego, once brimming with inflated self-importance, had been pierced by the quiet, unshakable strength of the woman he had disrespected. Chief Cole didn't even wait for his response. She didn't need to. She simply slid her sunglasses back over her eyes with a practiced motion, like it was all part of a routine. A routine Jack wasn't a part of, a routine she had mastered long before she ever set foot in this precinct. She was confident, calm, and completely unbothered by the storm of emotion he was swirling in. And with that, she turned away, her movement smooth, deliberate. There was no rush, no sense of urgency. She didn't need to prove herself to him, she already had. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the parking lot as she walked away, each click of her heels a stark reminder of just how far out of his depth he was. Jack stood there, rooted to the spot, his gaze locked onto her retreating figure. For a split second, he considered running after her, calling her back, begging for another chance to fix this, to regain some shred of his dignity. But he knew, even before the thought fully formed, that it would be futile. She wasn't someone who could be swayed by desperation or apologies. She had no need for his forgiveness. The wind, once a slight breeze, now seemed to cut through him with a biting chill, as though the world itself was in on the joke. He was a man who had just thrown away everything he'd worked for, in a matter of seconds. All because of his own ignorance and hubris. The taste of humiliation hung in his mouth, sharp and bitter, and it made him sick to his stomach. As Chief Cole disappeared through the doors of the station, her figure swallowed up by the shadows of the building, Jack remained in the parking lot, his body still trembling with the aftershocks of the confrontation. His thoughts were like a broken record, repeating over and over the same painful realization: he had just messed with the one person who had the power to destroy him. His days of bullying his way through the precinct, of sneering at anyone who didn't fit his narrow view of the world, were over. The thought was almost impossible to grasp. The air around him felt thick and oppressive, suffocating even. He had been the top dog here, the one others had feared and respected, but now? Now, he was just a man with a target on his back, one who had made an enemy out of the person who could ruin him with a simple phone call. Jack slowly lowered his head, his hands trembling slightly as they dug into the pockets of his uniform. He wanted to disappear, to run far away from this moment and forget it ever happened. But there was no escaping it now. Chief Cole's words were imprinted in his mind, echoing in his ears. Tomorrow, it would all start. Tomorrow, he would report directly to her. He would no longer have any say in how things ran. He would be answering to the woman he had humiliated. The reality of it all hit him with full force. The fear, the dread, the knowledge that his position in the precinct was no longer secure. The small, sad flicker of what had once been his smug confidence went out like a candle in the wind. Jack exhaled sharply, but the release didn't feel like relief. It felt like the first step down a path that he couldn't turn back from. And as the doors to the station swung shut behind him, the last trace of control he'd ever had over his own fate seemed to vanish into the quiet of the morning.